So what we're going to be looking at today is alternative text. So we're going to be working through examples that are very well linked to science and the types of diagrams and images that you'll be looking at. So we're going to kick off by looking at exactly what we mean by digital accessibility. We'll then look into why alternative text, often called alt text, matters. We'll look at some examples, and then I'm hoping that each one of you will have had a chance to reflect on one small change that you can make going forward in your digital practice. Okay, so what do we mean by digital accessibility? So the first thing that we have to consider is compliance. So as a public sector body, we are actually subject to the EU Web Accessibility Directive. So that means that any content that we are posting on our website or on Brightspace should be what's called WCAG compliant. So that's WCAG compliant. And that there's a set of standards that go with that. So that's things like ensuring that any images have a textual alternative. So for instance, alt text. It's things like using headers and accessible color contrast as well. Digital accessibility also means equity of access to digital information. So it's really important that we're saying equity. It doesn't mean that it has to be accessed in the same way. So for instance, with alt text, we would have an image, but we'd also have the choice of text. But it also means if someone is using assistive technologies or if someone's using a mobile device, they have the same user experience and functionality as someone who's on a computer. Thinking about digital accessibility, we might also want to take in the principles of universal design for learning. So I know some of you have probably completed your UDL badge. So that's the likes of our multiple means of representation. So if we use a flowchart, can we also maybe offer a text description? If we are asking students to read a journal article, is there any way that we can provide an MP3 of that as well? And ultimately, what digital accessibility amounts to is actually giving students freedom when it comes to engaging with their digital text. It means that they're not having to ask for assistance, they're not being delayed waiting for accessible copies of material. We can all go about our business and go about our studies on our own terms and in a way that works for us. So how do we measure and implement digital accessibility? So as I mentioned, we have the WCAG guidelines and we also have the Web Accessibility Directive, and that hyperlink will bring you to a really nice summary by AHEAD, which is a disability organisation specialising in Irish higher education. We've then got accessibility checkers. So I'm hoping all of you are familiar with Ally in Brightspace. It's listed under your module tools, and it actually measures the content you upload against the WCAG guidelines. Okay, you've then got a built-in checker in Microsoft Office. So that's under the review tab. And then there's also the Web Aim contrast tracker for when you're looking at different sort of colors and choices for your slides, for instance. Okay, but beyond that, we can also take into account the UDL principles. And what you'll find is once you're applying UDL, so thinking about your multiple means of expression, your multiple means of representation, naturally your materials will start to become more accessible. And of course, we need to take into account student feedback, okay? Really, really important, particularly when we're working with students with disabilities. So for instance, if you have a student with a visual impairment, they may experience colors in different ways, they might have font preferences, and exactly the same with students with specific learning difficulties as well. So it's always good just to have that open dialogue. So brief summary of alt text. What is it? So alt text is a textual description that can stand in place of an image. Okay. Now, when you're writing alt text, you're not looking to describe every element of the picture. What you're actually trying to do is to convey the meaning. So when we put a picture in context, what are we wanting sighted people to take from it? And then translating that into a brief text summary. Okay, so if you have a picture of students in a lab in the UCD prospectus versus a picture of students in a lab in maybe safety guidelines, your alt text is probably going to focus on different things. Okay, where is alt text used? So really, we should be using alt text in any digital resources that have an image. So that could be web pages, lecture notes, and also exam papers as well. Okay, so it's important to remember that some of our students use digital exam papers in order to use their assistive technologies. So things like magnifiers or read aloud software. So who uses alt text? Primarily, alt text is used by screen reader users. That's usually people who are blind or visually impaired. And what a screen reader does is it reads out all elements of a web page. And when I say all elements, I don't just mean text that would be visible to you or I if we were just using our eyesight. I also mean things like headings. I mean things like image descriptions. I mean things like links as well. So every element of the page, it reads out, okay? If you have students using the alternative formats on Ally, so maybe if they want to download their slides as an MP3 file, please note that it will also read the alt text. And same if you have a student who maybe has poor bandwidth and they're browsing the web, what will display is alt text in place of images. On this slide, I'm trying to give an overview of how you actually add alt text. So for Microsoft products and the Google Suite, it's fairly straightforward. You right click on the image or the shape and you have edit alternative text. For Apple product, you're going to go to format and descriptions. HTML, I've provided a link for coding in alt tags. Twitter, you can now add alt text, and actually Twitter shows alt text for absolutely everyone. So it's really obvious if you aren't including it, okay? So you can turn on wee reminders so you don't forget. And then if you're using Beamer, it's a little bit more complicated. Depends on the packages that you already have installed. So you might want to also consider just adding good captions as well as your alt text. There's a blog from UCL that gives a good overview of all of that. So as you're going through this, I would love for you to take a wee pause. I'm going to upload the slides and actually listen to this video, okay? What the video is going to show is actually what a screen reader sounds like, okay? Once you hear that, you'll hear it reads out all the different elements, okay? And it also, if you don't use alt text, what it will read instead is it'll actually read the file name. So in theory, you could have someone who's getting a stream of random letters and numbers read out and then point to JPEG or point to PNG, okay? So really, really important, even if you don't think that the image is, you know, needs alt text, maybe it's just a logo, you should still mark it as decorative. Otherwise, the person's going to have to hear no alt text and the image file name. Okay. So why do we use images? And this is not a trick question. Loads of reasons that we use images. And this is probably the first step actually in writing your alt text, is to pause and reflect as to why you're using the particular image. Why is it there? Okay. So we have aesthetics. Maybe we're trying to break up a really wordy page and we put in the UCD logo, or maybe we put in a nice border or things like that. You still have the option of marking those as decorative, and that's what you should do. As I said, otherwise the file name is going to be read out. If you mark it as decorative, it won't be included in the reading order for the screen reader. It'll just ignore it, okay? Alternative understanding. So that motto of a picture paints 1,000 words. Sometimes it's easier to convey a lot of written information in a visual format. So I'm thinking of graphs of tables or a flow chart of a written process. Sometimes we'll have complementary knowledge. So what we're doing there is we're clarifying information. So maybe we have safety instructions in the lab and we have images that go along with them. Or if you think about when you're on an airplane, you would have images because maybe not everyone speaks English or whatever language the company speaks, okay? And then you have unique images. So the likes of maps, where really an image is the most straightforward and direct way to convey the information. Now, we've got 2 stars on the screen here. So we've got one beside aesthetics and one beside alternative understanding. Depending on the context, you may not need to add alternative. Just mark them as decorative. So that's particularly the case for aesthetics, but it can sometimes be the case for alternative understanding as well, if you've covered it well enough in another format, so usually in the written body of the text. So the first example here we've got here is anatomy, and I've taken this from the University of Lancaster. So what we've got on the screen is we've got a diagram of the heart, and it's showing the way oxygenated and deoxygenated blood moves through the heart, and you see you've got the various chambers and valves all labelled. And we're going to take this in the context of first year lecture notes looking at circulation. So on the surface, this seems like a tricky diagram. You're probably wondering, how on earth am I going to write a summary for this? Okay. So we've got some possible solutions here. The first one is we're going to write really brief alt text. So we're going to say what the image is doing. Okay. So it's anatomy of the cardiac cycle. But what we're then going to do is we're going to write a longer description, and we're going to include it in the lecture notes for everyone. And what we're doing there is we're adding our multiple means of representation. So it might not be just students with visual impairment who struggle with the diagram. You can have students with processing difficulties. You can have students who just prefer to read words, and that's how they take in information. So again, we're thinking about, why did we have this diagram? So first of all, we wanted students to understand the structure of the heart, and then we wanted them to explain the process of how blood is actually moving through the heart. So what we've got here is a really just clear explanation of the various parts of the anatomy. So we're literally working through the heart. So we've got diagram illustrates the anatomy of the cardiac cycle. It shows a cross section of the heart. Blood enters the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava. And it just works through that. And then we've also got a step-by-step process of the heart and how it's operating. So we've got step one, in contraction, the heart pumps blood out through the arteries. In relaxation, the heart fills with blood. One complete sequence of filling and pumping blood is called a cardiac cycle. And we just work through it that way. So we're literally saying what someone would see as they worked through the diagram. Another challenge that we can sometimes get in scientific disciplines is graphs. So I've taken one here from the University for All Data. It's an area chart of UCD undergraduate outward mobility. The context that I'm given for this particular diagram is we're maybe in a widening participation meeting looking at Erasmus opportunities. So looking at the area chart, we can see in dark green, we've got the undergraduate population. We've then got the access population in light green, and we've got the target. And as you'll see, the access population is well below the intended target. So 3 steps to dealing with this graph. First thing we're going to do is we're going to give our alt text. And we're thinking about, why did we use this diagram? Why did we use this graph? We used this graph because it was particularly striking and showing just how far below the target we actually were. And that's what we're going to say in the alt text. We're going to take the key piece of data. So the main thing that was the story that was being told by the data was the low representation. So we've got area chart comparing broader undergraduate outward mobility and representation of access cohorts within this. Access students are significantly underrepresented and consistently below the 35% target. Step 2, we're going to give another source for the data. Okay, so we might include a URL to the University for All website, or we might provide a Google Sheet with the data, or we might just include a good old-fashioned table. And if you are presenting this, so if you're in a lecture or if you're at a conference, you should also be verbally describing any charts or diagrams that you're presenting. Same for really any images that are conveying meaning. Okay, so you don't necessarily know who's in your audience. So always sum up what's on the screen. This is a fairly basic formula for writing alt text for graphs. As long as you're following this, you're going to be fairly okay with your alt text. And it's nice when you're just getting into the habit of it. So we've got the type of chart, the type of data, and then the reason you're showing the data. And then with that, as I said, include a link to an alternative source of data, or actually just include it in your resources. What we've got next then is a flowchart or a process map. Now, for this, I've got a really basic flowchart, okay? So it's summing up what to do when you lose an object, and we're taking as a context a workshop to help students with time management. Okay. So again, we would do a brief alt text. So decision-making tree for managing lost items. And then we're going to have some supplementary text. And in your brief alt text, you could also include the fact that there's some supplementary information in the body of the text below, or you could also be including a link, a URL to your resources, okay? But because we're going with the principle of multiple means of representation, where you're providing alternative resources of information, it's best practice to include it for everyone, not to just bury it in the alt text. Okay, so for our supplementary text, what we've got is a numbered list of the different steps of the process chart. And you'll see that I've used A and B for each option. So if you find the item, you're going to stop clicking. If the item is still lost, you're going to proceed to the next step. Now, when you're writing these process charts, it's best to do them in a nested format. So I've used the 1, 2, and 3, and then I've got my A and B for sort of subsections. You could also consider using headings, and that's what I would do for very complicated diagrams. The reason I would say use headings for the main steps is where someone who's using a screen reader, what they can do is they can actually tab between headings. Okay, so they can skip sections rather than having to listen to the entire page. And that's why it's important to listen to that video of the screen reader. Because it really stresses the fact that for someone who uses a screen reader, they are listening to information all day. So if you think of the quantity of web pages that we skim and scan through, the quantity of sheets that we process visually, and then translate that into someone who's had to listen to the information all the time, where possible, let's try and make life straightforward for our screen reader users. Similarly, if you're using headings in your documents, so if you maybe make PDFs, it means that people can actually skip between the headings and they can see them listed in different chapters. So again, we're making life better for everyone. So something that comes up, frankly, a fair wee bit in my role working with students with visual impairments is visual bias in exam papers, okay? So what we mean by visual bias is the idea that in a question, there's only one way to access that and understand that particular question, and it's through an image or a diagram. So that could be things like labeling diagrams or identifying different steps in a process based on a chart, okay? Now, I understand that with science, usually information is being conveyed in a visual format. But under the WCAG guidelines, there should always be a textual alternative. Now, one of the things that I get asked a lot is, well, how do I write alt text without writing the answer? And what I've got is a link to a really thorough guide on writing image descriptions for assessment. And on the screen, you'll see I've got a question from a physics paper, and it shows a really lovely, straightforward explanation of the diagram. So you've got stacks of cylinders with planks between them, and it's asking about horizontal acceleration. You'll see it's got really well summed up exactly what's happening in the diagram. So there are ways of writing exam papers to support students with visual impairments and to avoid visual bias. And what you're doing as well is you're giving all your students another way of understanding the question and show them what they know. And really that's what we want in assessment, is to give students the best opportunity possible to show off their knowledge. The alternative, when we don't include written descriptions of diagrams, is students with visual impairments in particular end up relying on human readers. And with that, you're then having to get someone who understands the discipline and also who can sum up what you're asking in the easiest way possible. And that's not fair on the person writing this, given the description in person, or on the student who's now sat in an exam panicking because they don't understand what a person is saying to them. So when we're designing questions, we should be thinking, would someone be able to understand this question without the diagram? So when we're writing alt text, this is our checklist. So consider the context of the image. Why is the image there? Okay, use this to inform your description. Be brief. You don't have to write reams of poetry with your alt text, because don't forget the person's listening to it. And always end your alt text with a full stop. What this does is actually means the screen reader pauses, and it says, and it sort of indicates that the textual description is finished. Avoid a picture of X, Y, or Z. So the screen reader will announce that there is a picture. Where you do need to specify picture is the type of picture. So as we saw with the graphs, you should name the type of chart. Similarly, if you've got a cartoon or if you've got a screen grab of a piece of software, make sure you mention that and make sure you name the software. That's a really common error that we would see a lot with alt text. Similarly, we've said this before, if an image is decorative, note this, okay? Literally just tick on Microsoft PowerPoint, decorative, and it'll be disregarded. As we come to the end then, just to remind you that Global Accessibility Awareness Day is on the 18th of May. We'll be hosting a ton of events in the Access and Lifelong Learning Centre. So lightning talks on different elements of accessibility. And these will also be hybrid, and we'll have a coffee morning at 10 o'clock as well. So it would be lovely to see some of you there. We're also taking part in the Ally Fixture Content Day, which is a global competition where institutions that have Ally commit to upping their scores on their different modules. Pro tip, the alt text is a really quick way to up your score, and it's really important for ensuring that we're including all our students. So you can get more information from scanning the QR code or from our website as well.